I'm going back and forth between different screens. So Joelle and Maya, if you participants can't hear, please let us know in the chat. And Joelle and Maya, if you could communicate with me, whatever you need to, that would be great. So what are we doing here tonight? My goal for us tonight is not to come out of this evening experts on trauma and resilience through a Jewish lens. We have an hour and a half together. But what I do hope is that we all leave tonight with a deeper sense of what trauma and resilience are, how they are relevant to our work in communal and organizational lives, how we can explore regulating our nervous systems, self-regulation and co-regulation with others in our communities and organizations, and how we can source wisdom from Jewish tradition to bolster our understanding of what resilience means and to bring ritual alive in a way that enhances our deep, deep resiliency. In a couple of minutes, or just in a minute or so, we'll move into a presentation about trauma, stress, and the body brain. I'll offer up a lot of information, and we'll have a couple of different points to pause for questions. And then we'll go into breakout rooms for you to explore that information with each other, to process that information more. I'll provide some prompts, but you'll also have that space to use as you need to explore the content that we're discussing and find what's really relevant and meaningful and insightful for you, and then bring that back in a brief share back. Then we'll move into a collective exploration of resilience within Jewish tradition. If you've never used a Google Jamboard, tonight you're lucky, you get to learn how. And we'll close together with sharing some learnings from the evening and also counting the Omer. And we'll explain what the Omer is and what the counting is about when we get to that ritual tonight. So before I dive deep into exploring definitions of trauma and stress and the nervous system, I want to explore a concept called the window of tolerance. And this is a concept developed by a family and child psychiatrist named Dan Siegel. The idea here with the window of tolerance is that when we are in a state in which we are able to respond to stimuli in our environment from a grounded, flexible, open and curious, present state of being, that means that we're operating within our window of tolerance. It means we are operating from a state of greatest resiliency and ability to actively respond and regulate so that we don't have reactions that are disproportionate or inappropriate to the stimulus around us. And so that we have a full range of options about how we engage with the world around us and what choices we make to interact with those stimuli or those challenges. This yellow line in this diagram represents hormonal activity. So we've got stress hormones in our body that go up and down naturally throughout the day. Any little stressful moment, someone cutting us off in the road, that can raise cortisol. But if we're in our window of tolerance, that cortisol can come back down and we're able to stay present still and continue on in a functional way. However, if we are under a lot of stress, or if our nervous systems are carrying trauma in such a way that our window of tolerance has shrunk, then you can imagine that that yellow line that in a larger window can stay within a window of tolerance. If that window shrinks, then getting cut off on the highway can suddenly throw us way out of balance. And it's really hard for us to come back into balance. And when that happens, we're in what is called either a state of hyperarousal, the red part at the top, or a state of hypoarousal at the bottom. If we're hyperaroused, we might experience anxiety or anger or overwhelm. We might feel the fight or flight reaction or like chaos. I don't know what to do with it all. And if we're hypoaroused, we might have that feeling of shutdown, of freezing, of withdrawing. Throughout our time tonight and throughout our lives, I invite you to take stock of your nervous system. And if at any time you feel yourself moving out of the grounded, flexible, present window of tolerance, what can you do? Here are a few things that I do every day, multiple times a day. I do these things to keep myself in my window of tolerance, to bring myself back when I'm feeling hyper or hypo-aroused. One thing I do, I lightly stamp my feet. Sometimes I stamp hard or I kick things if I have a lot of energy to move. That can also feel really good. But just a little bit of stamping helps this sensory motor part of my brain remember, here's the ground. I'm anchored. I'm okay. Sometimes I like to give attention to a part of my body or to a movement that feels really good. The way that our brains work synaptically, whatever we pay attention to amplifies. So if I pay attention to the thing that hurts, to the thing I'm afraid of, that is going to grow. Those brain patterns, those routes are going to keep getting stronger. And so by actively turning my attention to something that feels good, oh, well, my shoulder might hurt, but my right hip actually feels okay. And I'm just going to do a couple little figure eights there and say hello to my hip that feels nice. Paying attention to that thing that feels good can actually help my brain to come back into a regulated state. As can long, slow exhales. That stimulates the parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest part of our nervous systems. As can more relational. We have the sensation and the movement kinds of regulating activity. We also have relational regulating activity. So I might think of someone or some place that brings me joy or makes me feel safe or connected. If I'm watching this webinar with someone, I might take a hand and just feel some touch and connection for a minute, or look at a photo of someone who loves me, feel connected. Okay, so if at all, at any time, you start to feel yourself moving out of your window of tolerance, remember that you have many tools at your disposal. So talking about trauma, what do I mean by trauma? Trauma can mean a lot of different things. So what I mean is pain and fear that we carry in our bodies that results from a threat to our sense of safety, dignity, or belonging. We are human animals, which means that we are biologically predisposed to reproduce, to be part of the pack, to be protected by the pack. And when anything happens that threatens our capacity to reproduce and belong in our group, our nervous systems experience that as a threat to our lives. And those threats can cause trauma in a way that we might be able to discharge and move through and move on from, or in a way that can get stuck in our bodies and nervous systems. The way that trauma can get stuck in our nervous systems is that we have these stress hormones, norepinephrine, cortisol, adrenaline, and their job is to keep our bodies alive. But if we don't move those stress hormones out of our bodies after that moment of real threat, what can happen is they can get lodged in our bodies. This image gives kind of a conceptual idea of how stress hormones can accumulate and get stuck in different places in our bodies. So just imagine anything that is not supposed to be there in great quantities can cause problems. When it comes to stress hormones, we're talking anything from fatigue to chronic pain to high blood pressure to heart palpitations to all sorts of things. So even if we're no longer physically in danger, if these hormones are lodged in our bodies, our nervous system doesn't realize that we're not still in danger. And so we may still exhibit the same behavioral and physiological patterns that emerged in the actual moment that we needed to physically fight for our survival. The last piece I want to highlight in my definition of trauma for tonight is that trauma can occur because of a specific moment or incident, like a car accident or you get mugged. Trauma can also occur in a longer term way, in a cultural, historical, or intergenerational way. So for example, slavery or genocide. I haven't experienced those things, but my ancestors have. And through epigenetic transmission, through embodied memory, that trauma lives on in my body in some way. I also know of some Jews who don't have a personal connection to the Holocaust, but they feel Holocaust trauma anyway. Why is that? That's that cultural trauma piece, where even if we didn't experience it ourselves, there's a wound to the soul of our people. It is a cultural soul wound. And that can also be transmitted to people. I'm not saying it always does. We all are different, unique humans, but it can be transmitted. So when I talk about trauma tonight, this is how I am approaching what trauma is. Let's talk about the brain for a minute, and then we'll pause for any questions so far. So I invite you to put your hand up and explore this hand model, also developed by Dan Siegel. In this hand model of the brain, my wrist is the spinal cord. The base of my palm, the heel of my palm, is the base of my skull. The fleshy part of my palm is the brainstem. This is my reptilian brain. This is my instinctual brain, the part that says fight or flight, keep breathing, keep heart pumping. That is the purely instinctual part of my brain that wants to keep me alive. The thumb here, if you tuck your thumb in, this is the limbic region of the brain. All mammals have a limbic region, as do some other organisms. And the limbic region of the brain is responsible for memory and emotion. The fingers, if you close your fingers down over that limbic system, this is the neocortex. This is the part that in humans is really enlarged more than in other mammals and apes. This is the part that is responsible for language, logic, planning, predicting. And so when our brain is working in harmony between all three parts, we have access to our instincts, our emotion, our memory, and our logic, our language. But when there's a threat to our survival, what happens? Dan calls it flipping our lid. The neocortex goes offline. And the way the routes work in our brain, literally this part of our brain is no longer available to us. I was in a car accident recently with my mother. And at first I couldn't talk. I forgot to call the police to get the police report. A half hour later, I was like, wait a minute, I need a police report. And then I could actually think and use this part of my brain again. But in that moment, I was coming purely from this reptile and limbic part of my brain. In a moment of pure survival, it's helpful to have this part of the brain kick on. But think about what happens if we are in interpersonal or professional relationships and people have trauma reactions going on, causing their lids to flip. And then you have multiple people in a space who are trying to plan a program or a meeting or develop a budget or whatever they're trying to do. And they're coming at each other from these instinctual and emotional trauma reaction places of the brain. That can actually be even more stressful and then bring up a fresh threat to survival, to one's job or livelihood. So we want to learn how, when our lid is about to flip, how to bring that back down so that we have access to our entire brain. I'm going to pause there. I'm going to stop my screen share for a few moments so I can see all of you. And we'll see if you have any questions so far. And you can feel free to voice questions. You can come off mute. You can put them into the chat.
I have a question. I can see how the brain would flip on a trigger, but how does it stay in that position for long-term trauma because the person is still functioning in other areas of their life?
Great. So two things I would say to that. One is we are very skilled at developing survival strategies, coping strategies. So even if we have trauma embedded in our nervous system that is causing us to exhibit trauma responses in certain areas of our life. We also might develop coping strategies that enable us to completely, like for me, one of my strategies has been like tunnel focus. I can just get so into the thing that I'm doing that all else of that, I've compartmentalized it somewhere over there. I'm not looking at it. And I'm just focused on the one thing I'm focused on. However, as soon as that thing ends, if anything reminds me slightly of that thing over there that I've been pushing away, I'm right back up to a flipped lid.
Mhm.
Does that answer your question?
Somewhat, yeah. Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions for now? And I'll say this also, I come at this as an educator and as a person who not only orients to education, but orients to education as a healing force in the world. I don't come to this as a social worker or a psychologist. I have studied trauma. I've studied trauma-informed education, but where I come to this work from is an educator who believes in the healing potential of learning.
I think this is all really interesting, and it's just all kind of turning in my mind. So looking forward to more.
Okay, let's keep on a bit more. And if you have more questions, keep feeling free to put them in the chat. Hang on, I'll go back to my screen share in just a second. I'm also still learning my way through Zoom. No shame in admitting it. All right. Okay, so what can trauma reactions look like? If we have all these stress hormones lodged in our bodies and we have not successfully discharged them from our systems, what can that look like? Here is one way of thinking about that. This is a chart developed by Eastern Mennonite University. It's part of their STAR training, Strategies for Trauma Awareness and Resilience. They refer to trauma reactions as normal reactions to abnormal situations. And they break down these different categories of emotional, cognitive, behavioral, physical, spiritual, and societal effects. Now, again, we're unique people. So some of these things might really resonate and some might not resonate at all. That's perfectly fine. And I invite folks to scan over this chart and notice if any of these bullets stand out to you as something you experience, as something someone you know exhibits, as a quality that an entire organization or community you're part of exhibits. And I'll just read a couple bullets from each one as you scan the page. Emotional expressions: anxiety, terror, irritability. Cognitive expressions: being really critical, blaming people, being suspicious or hypervigilant. Behavioral expressions: self-harm, erratic movement, feeling clumsy. Physical expressions: twitching, rapid heart rate, fatigue, insomnia, grinding teeth. Spiritual expressions: loss of meaning, mistrust, alienation. Or societal effects, or we could also say collective communal effects: high rates of alcoholism, drug abuse, mental health issues, denial, lack of empathy. I'll show you another way of thinking about expressions of trauma. This was created by Joe Kent Katz, this map of internalized anti-Semitism for white Ashkenazi Jews in the US. Very specific identity group here. And when we say internalized anti-Semitism, to me, that is almost synonymous with trauma reactions. And for our purposes tonight, internalized anti-Semitism is synonymous with trauma reactions. So in this map and model, which you can find at transcendingjewishtrauma.com, there's this central terror and sense of otherness that imbues everything. And that can create all of these other bubbles on the sides, a sense of powerlessness, a drive for security, a drive for acceptance by way of perfection, a desire to control, and more. And when I look at this map, to me, it is very striking because I see a lot of these patterns show up in myself and in Jewish communities and institutions that I've been part of as a community member, as an employee. And it makes sense to me because if I think about questions that in my life today might be fairly mundane, like how many potatoes should I put in the soup? Or which jacket should I wear? Or which trail should I walk on today? Those on the surface should not be deeply stressful questions, but I can get very stressed out by them. I can get really stuck in a mode of indecision or a sense of urgency about what needs to happen right now combined with indecision. Or I can be hurrying so much that then I mess something up and then I feel like I'm like worthless or like not good enough for who, for what. It's very confusing, but it's very strong in my nervous system. And when I look at where that might come from, it makes sense. Because from the perspective of internalized anti-Semitism or Jewish trauma, those questions for my ancestors were not mundane. How many potatoes should I put in the soup? Was really a question of, will I be able to feed my children this Shabbat? The question of which jacket to wear was really a question of, if I get taken away in a wagon, will I freeze to death? The question of which trail should I hike on today was really for them a question of, which way is the gas chamber? Even just speaking that out loud, I feel my nervous system go into some of that hypoarousal, that shutdown, that withdrawal. And that's me being aware of just an example I'm giving you. There are plenty of other times that I walk through the world and people I witness walk through the world, I think not even realizing that we're embodying some of these embedded patterns. Where I've seen it in Jewish organizational life, how much indecision can happen at a meeting, or how much urgency can happen in an email inbox. Really, on Friday afternoon at 4 p.m., it's coming with like alert flags and like what are we? This can't wait until Sunday morning when I'm going to see you in person and we can talk it out. So again, this might not resonate for everyone, but it is meant, at least as a jumping off point, to consider what are different ways that trauma could be showing up in my life, that if I were not framing it that way, I might just frame as neuroses, or that's how I am, or that's how this person is who I'm in relationship with. My question for tonight is, how might trauma be animating some of that? And how can we shift that to patterns of resiliency instead? I invite you to take stock of your nervous system again. Notice if you're still in your window of tolerance, or if you've moved out of that window. And if you've moved out of that window, here are some things we can do to return. The first 4 stars we already talked about. And the last 3 are another set of sensation, movement, and relation ideas, ways of bringing our brain back online in a regulated way. And that goes through the instinctual reptile brain, that's sensation and movement, into relation, the limbic system, so that we can bring our cognition, our neocortex back into the conversation. I'm going to stop my screen share again and say, are there any questions there? Or thoughts or reflections?
Yeah, one thought I had, you kind of brought it up, this is Felicia, was just, it's easy enough to hear about it and think about it, reflect on all of these. It's a lot harder when it's coming at you. And it's like, there's almost like a neuron mirroring thing that can happen. And so it's just, it's more challenging then, I think. Somebody around you is really anxious and they've got to get this done. And it's like, it's hard to keep your voice from getting, well, maybe not yet. It's like, yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Mirror neurons, that's that, if folks aren't familiar, that's the idea that we can mirror what's going on in someone else's nervous system. Like if a person with male genitalia gets kicked and other people see it, those other males might really feel the pain. That's the best example I can come up with, even though I don't share those body parts. That's the best one I can come up with. People always seem to understand. That's mirror neurons right there. So Felicia, I hear you. When someone is coming at you with all the hurriedness and the this and the that, is, how do we keep our own selves in regulation when that's coming at us? It's hard.
Felicia, that's a really good thing to bring up. And it kind of makes sense when you think about it, because if you're a human living in community and one person in the community is threatened, it may be that other people in the community are in fact threatened too. So the fact that we have those mirror neurons and we have the instinct to respond to a crisis with urgency, even if it wasn't an urgency we invented or is actually happening to us, I think that instinct might have served us at some point in our evolutionary history.
Absolutely, and still does. I mean, it helps us to connect with each other and understand each other too. Yeah.
Absolutely right. And that raises the question of how much empathy is effective for our own wellness and survival, and what is that line between taking in and recognizing and reflecting back, and also holding our own.
Are we going to talk about the lists of different ways that trauma appears later? Like,
Yes.
is that going to be part of our discussion time?
Yeah, so unless there are any other questions for right now, we're going to go into breakout rooms and explore exactly those questions. Maya, I'll put the questions into the breakout rooms. But Maya's going to put us in breakout rooms of 3. And anything from what we've talked about so far that you want to discuss is totally game for discussion. And I'll put a couple of prompts in that very specifically are about how we as individuals or in organizations or communities that we're part of might see some of these patterns emerging and what the impact of those patterns are. So we'll have about 12 minutes in breakout, and I'll broadcast the prompt questions to your rooms. Okay. So the first thing I want to say about resiliency is that it really happens in our brain. It all comes down to the brain. This is really my kick on life right now. It all comes down to our brains, because not only, well, I'll say this. We have, I'm not going to get all my neuro terminology correct, but in between the axons, I want to say, the parts of our nerve cells that are at the end that receive stimuli, there are these pathways between them. And the pathways have what's called a myelin sheath. And the myelin sheath that connects these neurons, that's how the messages get sent. And so the more times a message goes through a pathway, the thicker that myelin sheath gets, the stronger the pathway, and the faster the information transmits. So when we have trauma patterning in our bodies, what that means in our brains and in our nervous systems throughout our bodies is that those patterns are really strong. They're the fastest thing. We have to really work to repattern, to actually install new patterns in our brain and nervous system so that there's another option. And so when we're faced with something that is really activating, and maybe particularly activating because we know it's true in our own nervous system. Someone's anxiety is particularly activating because I myself am anxious. I need to actively choose a different pathway in my brain. And that's why these simple practices like putting our hands on our chests, long, slow exhales, butterflies happening, bilateral stimulation of the brain. One of the ones that I love is doing like across the body knee taps. That's causing the right and left hemispheres of my brain to communicate more with each other. And that helps to create new patterns. And new patterns take time to develop. In some embodiment in neuroscience theory, says 3,000 times for something to become an embodied pattern. So if I want to change my reaction to someone else's trauma pattern, it's going to take a lot of repetition for me to build that new pattern. But once I build that new pattern, it can start to happen with much less effort. And that is when life really changes. That is when I suddenly have way more options about how I show up in the world and how I engage with people. So that's the first thing I want to say about resiliency. Is that it's working in our brains. It's working in our spirits too, but tonight I'm really talking about the brain. I'm going to screen share again. I'm going to go to the second Jamboard slide here. And I want to talk about examples of resiliency within Jewish tradition and ritual. So I've written at the bottom, I know it's a little small. I apologize for that. It doesn't really let me make it bigger. But I'll read this definition. This is my own definition of resilience aloud. Resilience is the ability to adapt, center, and bend without breaking. It is the ability to remain within or return to one's window of tolerance when desired. It is the neurophysiological response in our bodies that gives us strength, courage, and clarity, even after or amidst pain, grief, horror, or fear. Resilience brings back a positive imagination for the future and lets us establish both safety and connection. Judaism is full of inherent resiliency practices, things that help our brains to wire pathways of resilience. A few things that stand out to me. One is the role of ritual, right? When I'm talking about synaptic patterning and it takes 3,000 times, well, 3,000 divided by 365, if I were to, say the Shema every day 3 times, that's actually a lot of times of repetition of a pathway in my brain that I'm developing. So any ritual in Judaism that we might take on with repetition is actually helping us to establish pathways in our brains and nervous systems. Chanting and vocalization. So sounding can help break through tissues. Remember those stress hormones that get lodged in our bodies and cause all sorts of issues? Using sound, this is where sound healing is really a thing. If you want to see something really wild, look up Victoria Hanna and Singing to Sand. It's a 45-second video. She sings to sand. She's an Israeli Kabbalistic sound artist, and the sand moves in these mandala shapes and kaleidoscopic rhythms through her voice. Our voices can break through old patterns in our tissues and in our brains. And Judaism calls us into chanting, vocalization, and song. We've also got this sensory motor stimulation piece, where if our reptile brain is activated, by doing these different kinds of sensory rituals like Havdalah with the fire and the spices and the grape juice or wine, or Shabbat with all of the singing and blessings and hand washing and children and challah and a meal, or the morning blessings of Birkot HaShachar, where I'm saying blessings literally as I am rising out of bed, as I'm bending over for the first time of the day, as I'm opening my eyes for the first time of the day. These are all rituals that help to bring this instinctual part of our brain into balance with the rest of our brain. That part about putting attention on what we want to amplify. Gratitude practice. Gratitude in Judaism, that's one of our original instructions. The first words out of our mouth when we wake up in the morning are supposed to be Moda Ani. I'm grateful, I'm thankful. If we really wake up every day and if we remind ourselves all throughout the day, what am I thankful for? How do I put attention on that good piece that helps to give me a sense of safety, belonging, connection? Judaism has that right in our instructions and prayer. And it has reminders of safety as well. I've been saying the bedtime Shema, and I have to say I've been sleeping better. I've been doing another thing too that has to do with tapping and different things. But it's combining the ritual piece, the repetition. It's combining the chanting and vocalization. It's combining a sensori-motor piece because I'm relaxing into bed. I'm feeling the softness of my blanket. I'm seeing the moon. It helps to bring all these pieces together. So these are just a few examples that have been alive for me. And I'm curious, what comes up for you when you look at your own experience of, knowledge about, or exposure to Jewish tradition, Jewish culture, Jewish ritual? Where do you see resiliency practice residing within Judaism? And again, you can put things right up on the Jamboard. You can speak aloud, or you can put them into the chat, and Maya will put them up on the Jamboard for you. I love that one. I remember after the Tree of Life synagogue shooting that Shabbat when I lit candles, and I really imagined all of the Jews all over the world lighting candles. That was powerful. That was really powerful. This is great, y'all. Keep going. Gathering in community for holidays and celebration, old recipes or food made and eaten with love, greater acceptance of Jewish holidays in the media, on the news, shown in a more positive light. Something else that comes up for me when I think of resiliency in Judaism, I think of all the ways that Judaism calls on us to, or instructs us and supports us to connect with our ancestors. Right? There's all sorts of, there's Yisker, there's Kaddish, right? There are these rituals that occur in different cycles. There's also the tradition of the Feldemestrin in Eastern Europe, who would wrap wicks. There were women in these communities. This was their job professionally, to wrap candle wicks around the gravestones or around the cemeteries in some cases, and to make candles, soul candles, for people who had passed. And these candles would be lit at the high holidays at Yom Kippur. That for me has been very powerful, to be able to call on my ancestors, to honor them and to feel their support in return, to feel them respond, is very powerful. Sukkot, when we're instructed to invite guests into the sukkah. We talk about the ancestral guests of Moshe and the foremothers and forefathers, but also the way I understand the mitzvah of ushpizin, of sacred guests in the sukkah, is also ancestors, that we're actually commanded to bring our ancestors into that celebration of joy with us. Vigils of Jews and the Islam and Muslim communities in response to violence occurring in either of our communities. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. If you know the words to the prayers, there are many positive words to linger over: compassion, blessing, love, kindness, strength, vastness, etc. Right, and talk about language. If we know the words, we also have language. We have Hebrew. We also have the many languages of Jews in diaspora and all the places we've come from, and Yiddish. All the ways that worldviews and story get embedded in language. We have many languages from diaspora that can also provide us resilience and sustenance. Practices of teshuvah, making amends in the world, and the ability to always return to your essence. The value held for studying and learning together, a way to get unstuck, absolutely. Yeah, the value for studying and learning together. Also, I find the practice of chavruta, of having a learning partner very specifically, to also be a source of resilience, right? We're talking about connection in that. We're talking about patterning. If I meet with the same person, if I do this learning with them, how deep can we go? What kinds of pathways in our brains can we pattern together through that relationship as well as the learning? You can feel it. Your juices are flowing now. New practices of anti-racism, anti-xenophobia, anti-patriarchy to add to the traditional ways. Right, and just that very piece of Torah as a living being, that Torah evolves and we evolve with Torah. That is a resilience quality in and of itself, that we're not stuck. We're never stuck in one place, but we don't need to be stuck in the past. In fact, we're not supposed to be. We're supposed to evolve and grow and move and change together. Question: how does kashrut express as a form of resiliency? Interesting question. I can speak to it, or if anyone else also wants to speak to it, please feel free. to drop ideas out loud or in the chat. I think that kashrut, some of the laws of kashrut are very practical. We talk about cleanliness, but there's also like pieces around nutrition. Like if we eat major sources of calcium and iron within 4 hours of each other, I forget which direction, but one of them absorbs or inhibits the absorption of the other. So on a nutritional level, I think that people understood that in some way, and probably midwives who were seeing mothers bleeding to death probably figured out something about iron and calcium and blood and our bodies. Or like Brit Milah, 8 days, that's when circumcision occurs. Vitamin K, that's the vitamin responsible for clotting the blood. And our bodies don't start to produce vitamin K until 8 days after birth. So I imagine that people who were trying to do Brit Milah figured this out. It didn't work so well with a number of babies. They had to figure out that 8 days was the magic number. So there are some very practical kind of pieces involved in kashrut that I think can help sustain our bodies and our sense of vigorousness and vitality. And then I think there's also these spiritual dimensions of kashrut that I can't speak from a really personal perspective because I don't keep fully kosher, and that's not my experience. But my understanding for folks who do is that there's something that spiritually that it can't be explained practically or pragmatically. That it's a deeper spiritual relationship with how food is raised, prepared, ingested. I can appreciate in terms of meat and milk that life-giving and life-taking are two very different energies, and we might not want to combine them, or we might want to be careful about how we combine them. That could be very intense for our nervous systems to take both of those energies in at the same time. So I don't have a really concrete, clear answer to your question, Gretchen, but those are some of my thoughts about kashrut. So feel free to keep adding to this Jamboard, but I also want to ask, as we're nearing the end of our time together, I want to ask, how are these frameworks around Jewish trauma and resilience relevant to your own experience of Jewish community life, or also Jewish communal work? Where does this apply or feel relevant in your own lives and work? And we are still recording, but if you would like to share something out loud and not have it recorded, Joelle, you can ask and Joelle will pause the recording.
I don't think it just relates to the Jewish community, but I think this practice of having this meta awareness of where your emotional state is, and having practices of getting back into a state where you're more integrated and in tune and less reactive, would be good in any community that you're in. And I think, the Jewish community sorely needs it. So does every community. So it's just a blessing. Thank you. I was also.
No, go ahead.
No, sorry, I've already talked.
Yeah. I'm finding this discussion to be very valuable on two levels. The concept of the window of tolerance and what we've talked about with respect to trauma is valuable and something I've been thinking about. But for me personally, as a non-practicing Jew who has been looking for a way to, or trying to find my way back to tradition at 72 has been challenging. And because I've spent so much time kind of thinking, oh, this isn't relevant and those traditions aren't relevant. That doesn't make a lot of sense. Hearing the relevance and understanding or reconnecting with some of the beauty of the traditions is very important to me now. So in terms of part of the journey that I'm on. So thank you for that. It was fortuitous.
I'm so glad to hear that. Thanks, Eugene. Any other thoughts on how this is relevant for you in your Jewish communal life or work? Or your personal Jewish life? It doesn't have to be communal. We are a community regardless, but.
I think for me, it's been very important. I just retired. I was a college professor. I'm also an occupational therapist, and especially helping students that were struggling. I often found myself at odds with the rest of the faculty because I felt they were being too harsh and not helpful enough. And I think as a community, Jews often come together to, I'm not sure rescue is the right word, but certainly to assist others who are struggling.
Right, and that in and of itself, it feels to me like part of the resiliency of the Jewish people, that there has always been a movement towards tikkun, towards healing and repair, and towards justice for ourselves and for others. That's there. It's embedded in our stories, and it can show up in so many ways in our communities.
My thought about this isn't fully formed, but it feels to me like these practices are a way to be able to hold our history of, I'm sorry, what happened right now? Be a way to be able to hold our history of challenging things that have happened. And even in times like now, when really horrible and challenging things are happening around us, and being able to hold both of those things and stay present. Because it feels like if you have in your family or in your people a history of terrible things, and then terrible things happen in your present, it feels sometimes it's hard to stay there, stay present and alive. And so these resiliency practices are a way to do that, to not deny or forget the past, and to not deny or forget what's happening now.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense on a kind of brain level to me also, in terms of when we have trauma reactions, it's our body believing us to be in the past, in that moment when we were in danger. And so if we can honor the past without being stuck in it, that is resiliency, that is healing, that is tikkun, that is tzedek, justice, that is all of the things. I want to share a few ways that we are beginning to think about some of this at Rachel's table. I am here tonight with my Rachel's table hat on. And Rachel's table, for those who are not familiar, is, well, actually, Jody, you're here now. I don't want to put you on the spot, but in case you would like to say anything about Rachel's table. But Rachel's table has been around for about 30 years. Jody, would you like to jump in? No pressure.
I'm
Jody,
sure you could do it.
okay.
I'm sure you could do it. But just, 30 years as the food rescue and redistribution program of the Jewish Federation of Western Mass. And we've grown so much, and also with Cara as part of our team, doing more and more looking at trauma, and Cara can describe that more, and also doing more with the justice work with our Growing Gardens initiative. So I'm going to leave it to you, Cara.
Great. So at Rachel's Table, the organization has existed for 30 years and is moving into this next stage of its life, really asking questions about who are we as a Jewish organization, and what is our vision for our impact in the world, and what does it mean to be doing Jewish food systems repair work, not simply food systems repair work. And one of the ways that I think about this is that the communities that we work with are more and more paying attention to the impacts of trauma in their own communities. How is trauma influencing food systems and people's engagement with food, right? In many communities of color, among immigrant communities, agriculture and food inherently comes with trauma. Plantations, slavery, being literally showered with DDT as you cross a border to go pick tomatoes in horrendous and abusive conditions, right? There is a lot of trauma related to food and growing food in the communities we work with. And so we need to be cognizant of how that might be coming up, as well as how our own trauma might be coming up, and how those traumas, remember how it is when the lids are flipped and now we're all facing each other trying to do something productive and beautiful, except we're coming from trauma reactions. How do we avoid that? How do we do something different? How do we resource ourselves and ground in resilience and recognize how our own patterns might actually be influencing our relationships and capacity to collaborate and build together? So we're beginning to ask those questions at Rachel's Table. And I also would say that at Rachel's Table, or in any organization or any community or professional space or ritual space, I want to emphasize what I see as the importance of trauma-informed leadership. That if people are spending a lot of time protecting themselves because they don't feel safe, that is time and energy that they are not spending on the vision of the organization or the community. And so if we want to bring out the deepest and the best and the most robust of what we all have to offer, it really behooves us to learn about trauma, to learn how it's impacting us, our communities, and to pattern something different into our nervous systems. I want to respect your time and find some closure. I'm so grateful for you all being here tonight. I will stay on the Zoom for a little longer if anyone wants to chat more or you have any other questions. If you want to put into the chat anything else that you are taking from tonight, please do. And if folks feel like you have a couple more minutes, would you like to count the Omer together? Joelle, I think you could stop the recording at this point. To actually, before you stop it, I want to say to anyone who's, well, never mind. Go ahead. I could have said that earlier to people watching the recording. Blessings to you all watching this recording.